What's up, everybody? This is Encanti from Zebbler Encanti Experience, and today I've partnered with the Music District as part of the Groove Theory tutorial series to bring you this deconstruction of our track Outside the Box, which is on Wakaan Records on our EP End Trance. This was a fun track to make, and the expectations were high right off the bat, because if you have a track called Outside the Box, you really can't slack on the sound design and the interesting tricks in here. So there's a big crazy breakdown in the middle, which I'm really proud of, and there's a lot of sound design in here to show off. But the most exciting thing about this track, I think, is the fact that almost all of the sound design was made with Ableton stock instruments and stock effects. So there's really not a lot of sounds in here that you can't just make at home right inside the box in Ableton. Let's get started with the synthesizer design at the first drop. Now this is a classic Hocket call and response style bass line between these two synthesizers and this one. Now you might be surprised to find out that both of these sounds are made using operator. I'm going to break down the first one and then the second one for you. This first one relies on a really interesting phenomenon called self-oscillating feedback. And this is what happens when you push a filter beyond 100% in the filter resonance. You see I've set up some macros here, but you can see what they're tied to over on the right side of the screen. Now, I'm going to do an experiment real quick. I'm actually going to go to the main oscillator, that's oscillator A, which is generating the tones. I'm going to turn that off. So all we're left with is oscillator C here, which is generating noise. If you push your feedback, I'm going to bring it down for a sec. See, that's just some noise. If you push your feedback past 100%, you end up getting a tone. There we go. And the harder you push that, the more clear the tone will become. Now, if you combine that with a tone coming from an oscillator, there's a lot of things you could probably do wrong when you're doing this, but ultimately I like to kind of think of it as a guitar. See, my favorite guitar player is Jimi Hendrix, and one thing I love they did was he took advantage of feedback coming out of his guitar amp. So kind of think about this as the A oscillator is your guitar string. This is the thing actually making the sound, but your resonance here, your filter resonance, is the feedback, and you can get these two tones to play with one another. What I'm doing for this sound is I'm creating kind of a modulation simply by playing the two tones, the filter frequency self-oscillating tone and the oscillator A tone at the same time. And I'm sweeping this filter frequency tone down while we're playing, and that creates this really kind of a cool phasing rhythm. You hear how it goes, zha-zha. If I bring down the resonance, it's just more of a straight decaying boom. But because we are self-oscillating, you end up getting phase cancellation. And in general, most of the time, people try to avoid phase cancellation. You know, that's when you have two notes kind of overlapping and one might be a little bit off, and it creates kind of an LFO sound. But I am using that LFO sound to create the very intentional motion there that kind of sounds like a open and closing filter on an LFO. And it's all just made by sweeping our filter frequency down with the resonance way high. And remember, this is a sine wave in our oscillator here. So sine waves generally don't work very well with filters, because sine waves don't have any harmonics. And what do filters do? They get rid of harmonics. So this is kind of an counterintuitive way to use a filter, but I found that this is a great way for getting that neuro sound that sounds really nice when you combine it with the kick drum. Oh, that's without the... Yeah, there with the automation on. I have my operator right here, but right below it I have OP noise. This is just some noise. But you might hear it kind of sounds like, has this kind of a rhythmic aspect to it. One thing I was experimenting with here is that instead of just playing the noise, I'm running the noise into another oscillator, and this is playing the same note as my bass line, but an octave lower. Now, normally you wouldn't be able to hear that. It's just too low. It creates kind of a flat tire sound. But when combined with noise, it kind of creates a really fast rhythm, like in key to the bass. So this is like a sub harmonic. It's not that noticeable, but because this kind of a is in key with the phase of the bass, I think it's kind of a cool sound, even if it's subconsciously enhancing the bass a little bit. Anyway, I got my bass right here. You can hear that's kind of muffled. So the purpose of this noise, which is very low, it's at -22. Purpose of that noise is just add a little decoration on the top. And this is just inside the same instrument rack. Going out of that, we go through a utility where the bass is mono, and then all of that goes into isotope trash 2. Now, I know I told you almost everything I did is inside of Ableton today with the stock instruments and effects, but if you're going to drop some money on any effect out there, I'm going to highly recommend Trash 2. I use it in almost all of my projects for bass music. What I'm doing here is I'm going through 2 stages of saturation. The first one is Blitz, and I've got the pre-gain turned way up and the drive just up just a hair. If my pre-gain was down a lot, I'd have to turn the drive up a bit more. So this is a way of kind of heating up the signal going into Trash before it hits the drive. After that, we go into a stage 2, which is just tape saturation. I think that the isotope Trash tape saturation sounds great. I got the drive very carefully adjusted right there. And then you'll see over on my right, I normally have the limiter on by default, which sounds great. But for this project, instead of turning the limiter on, my tape saturation is my last gain stage before going through the output. So I got to turn the level down on its way out a lot, significantly, just so I don't clip straight out of Trash. Most of the time, you won't have to do that because the limiter is on by default, but since I turned it off, this has got to come way down. Outside of Trash, and let's hear how it sounds without Trash. Would you listen to that? Trash adds so much of the timbre here. It's amazing. Going out of that, we go into an audio effects rack where I have 2 channels called Spread and Dry. Now, this is a technique I do all the time in my sound design, which cures the conundrum of having a dry wet knob. Anytime you have an effect with a dry wet knob, you have to sacrifice the dry signal in order to get the wet signal. So what I do to get around that, like in the case of an autofilter, let's say you want to use some autofilter, but you don't want just the whole sound to be going through autofilter. You want to mix that in a little bit. What I'm doing here is I've created an audio effects rack just by Command G, and I have one channel dedicated to a bunch of effects, and then another channel is just my dry signal. So this is a way of getting my dry signal and that same signal with effects on it without sacrificing the dry signal. Inside of my affected chain, I have this thing I made called Filter Dynamic Tube Bass Tone. And basically it's 2 chains in here, and as you can see, they're panned left and right, and both of them have a dynamic tube and an autofilter. And just moving between them, you can see that my settings for my autofilter is slightly different. Now, you can try this with just about any effects. If you put one in your left channel and one in your right channel and change the settings a little bit, it's going to slightly change the signal between the left and the right channel. And I think that this is a really nice way to spatialize things, really immediate and quick way, and really effective. I mean, especially when you're using an autofilter, I'm only spatializing frequencies above 778 hertz. So this does not touch my sub-bass frequencies where I might not want to spatialize things. And then we go out to meet a multiband dynamics right here, which is generally just crushing my top end. I've got a 1:25 ratio up here, 1 to infinity. This is just a limiter to keep my top, past 4.42 kilohertz under control. And I do this with a lot of bass sounds. I mean, the last thing that you want is some modulation that you do to go ahead and send some ear-piercing frequency. So a good way to stop things from getting too loud in a certain range is to just use multiband dynamics to kind of tame that range. I do that actually early on in sound design because who knows what button I'm accidentally going to press to make things really high pitched. It saves your ears and it saves you a lot of time when you get to mixing. Doing that nice and early on. All right, let's move on to this channel. Here we have our response, and I made this sound. I was listening to this artist who, his name is Kat, K-A-T-T. He came out with this series called the Opus Collection, which featured just gnarly lead lines, and I was listening to his Opus Collection a lot, and kind of trying to make a homage to his sort of sound there. And this is what I came up with. Basically, I got an instrument rack right here, and what's this right here? This is a little channel that just kind of creates these little bursts, almost like kind of kick drums. But you can hear it's spatialized, it's going through an echo and a glue compressor. What's the purpose of this? Well, what I'm doing in this channel right here is I'm creating a transient. I'm creating a transient out of thin air to be applied to any note that's going out of this instrument right here. And when those combine, the idea is that you don't hear this as a separate sound. You hear that transient kind of glued into this sound. So when I unsolo that, it's very subtle, but at the beginning of each note, it's adding kind of a doosh, doosh. You could even do this with drum sounds. I do this with kick drums all the time. I call this transient replacement. It's when you add a sound at the very beginning and then smash it into the sound that you're adding it to create the illusion that it's one sound. So we're going to be mainly focusing on the synthesizer sound that transient is smashed against. That's this one here. All right, we have another operator patch, and looking at it, we've got classic FM synthesis. We got B modulating A, and I'm using sine waves, though on the A sine wave, it's a sine wave that is at a reduced bit rate, and I'm getting a lot of these bends. Doo-doo. Not with pitch bend, but by moving this fine tune knob. I think that I did that because pitch bend is just so annoying. I'm always looking for ways to not use pitch bend and to automate the pitch anyway. This is on 0.5, but I ended up turning up the transpose up to positive 36. And then we have a lot of automation over here on the frequency and the resonance. And just like with the lead before, I am pushing that resonance way high to get some other tones. So let's see what happens once we get to 117% with the resonance. And let me turn that down, see what the sound's like without it. So it's not that different, but I think that basically this sound gets this kind of a guttural low sound right at the end because of that resonance pushed up. And I can kind of hear it in headphones. Maybe you can't hear it here, but it's a little more subtle than what this other one's doing. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff right there. I'm moving around transpose. There's a lot of automation. Let's go explore that a little bit. So what I think I probably did is I probably wrote all these notes and then later on just was playing around with the transpose and said, you know, that sounds really cool when you dip really low. And then I added the automations to make it go low. I just explore and I find cool knobs and I figure out ways to incorporate them. And certainly that's what I think I did here. Moving forward, we got another utility, which monos the low end. And then we go into this audio effect rack, which has 3 different channels, space, dry, and driver. Let's see what we're doing here in space. And then dry. Wow, that's what it actually sounds like straight out of operator. Isn't that crazy? And then driver. Okay, so let me explain kind of the purpose of these different channels here. With driver, I think that's probably just meant to be called drive. What we're doing is we are going through a heavy equalizer. It looks like I dialed in a really specific setting and then scaled it back, which I end up doing in sound design a lot. And then that's going into an overdrive. And as you can see, that overdrive is pretty much just enhancing lower frequencies. The cool thing about using drive on low frequencies is that you can always get more partials out of lower frequencies, but you can't get lower partials out of higher frequencies. So most of the time when I'm adding drive to things like voice and bass, I start by seeing what I can scoop out of the low end rather than putting it on the top end. And believe it or not, scooping things out of the low end is what gives me some of my best top end. Because when you saturate the lows, you end up getting harmonics in the highs. Of course, the EQ is there to kind of sculpt that on the way in as well. So really, this is just there to add this overdrive. And then we got a dry channel right here, which isn't completely dry. It looks like that there's this little EQ right here. And then we got space. Space is echo, and it appears here that we're doing the Haas effect. You can find the Haas effect on Wikipedia under the entry for the precedence effect. But essentially, it is a phenomenon that if you tune the left and the right channel with two different delays that are more or less 15 milliseconds separated from each other, then your resulting output will sound spatialized, at least somewhat spatialized. And the reason this is it's actually quite interesting. If you have a person standing to your left and talking to you, it takes slightly longer for that sound wave to travel around your head and get to your right ear. So you hear the person talking in both ears, but with a slight delay. And your brain uses that delay to figure out where in space that person is standing. It's pretty cool. The wave front that gets to you first is called the side with precedence. So here we have a right-leaning precedence effect. With then the second wavefront coming in on the left. The other thing I've done here with echo is I've turned the input up to 40. Now, why would I do that? First of all, echo, one of the reasons I love this new effect is because you can do this. No other effect in Ableton allows you to overdrive it by 40 decibels. I think that the other ones top out around like 20. This is just crazy to be able to overdrive a circuit model at 40 decibels. It really mulches the sound, and that's where the majority of the distortion is coming from on this sound. That's actually echo's distortion that's creating the majority of that. In addition to distorting the sound, I'm also modulating the delay, the Haas-affected delay, just a little bit, and the filter quite a bit more. But most of the modulation is coming from this that says env. And if you want to read about this, it'll generate an envelope follower, and the modulation here the depth, I believe, is affected by the signal going in. So that means that your left and your right channel and your filter and all that stuff is wiggling depending on the volume coming in. Kind of a cool way to allow echo to generate its own tones there. Then we got dynamic tube. You've seen me use this in my other patch above, and you might be wondering at this point, why does Ben use so much dynamic tube? Now, dynamic tube, the cool thing I love about it is, first of all, not a lot of people really know what it's for, really utilize it, so it feels like my secret weapon. But the bias knob on this thing is so fascinating. With every other distortion, quote unquote, you'll bring up the drive and it'll get louder and louder and clipping and distorted, and you get more harmonics and it gets really ugly. But with dynamic tube, as it gets closer to the threshold to which it starts, really affecting the signal, once it passes that threshold, the sound kind of disappears. And bias here, well, when you turn up the bias, let me just take this sound. You turn that bias and crank it up, and the sound doesn't get louder. It starts breaking apart. It's a little hard to notice. Let me just solo that. Do you hear it? How it kind of, that's like a straight sound, and then that's kind of wispy. It sounds like a circuit kind of breaking or crumbling. It's a neat sound to try with really dynamic sounds. The input level will, when you bring up the envelope, it'll cause the sound to kind of break apart some more. But check out dynamic tube on bass sounds and sounds with dynamics, because the crackly, poppy, breaking apart sound that bias makes is actually one of my favorite sounds. Then we go over to auto filter, which is just adding a little bit of resonance and has some automation down the line. After all that, we are spit out at another EQ, which is off, and a corpus. A lot of the time I sidechain my corpus. That's not the case right here. But what corpus does is, it's very subtle, but it will add kind of this stereo depth to your sounds. And it does so in such a classy way. It almost makes your sound like it's moving through a physical medium. And I find myself going to corpus for a lot of my sound design when I want it to sound a little more like wood, a little more like something actually breaking. Corpus is a really nice way to put that organic edge into your stuff. It's a little hard to notice in this tune, but I've gone nuts with this in other ones. A little more overdrive, and then OTT is a effect pulled right out of my Ableton folder. It's a preset for multiband dynamics. And OTT stands for over the top. It's basically lots of upwards compression, lots of downwards compression, and then to compensate the volume loss, we got a lot of output. And this is just such a brilliant effect, but in general, it's normally a little too over the top, so I got the amount turned down. Fun fact, multiband dynamics does not have a dry wet knob. It just has this knob that says amount. And if you want a dry wet knob with multiband dynamics, you actually have to put it into a group and create one of those chain fades. So watch yourself. When you put multiband dynamics on something, you are getting the sound of it. Even at amount 0%, it's going to color your tone. You cannot get a flat signal from in to out with amount all the way down. So we got amount turned halfway down. The amount, I guess you can think of as being like a scale. It's like time, it'll actually just scale the depth of all this stuff. And then we got some more auto filter, but let me highlight this one. This is a band reject filter, and I find this is really useful for getting interesting neuro sounds. Let's see what happens, just kind of moving through the sequence. Here we go. So right about here is where this guy engages. And without it. So it's very subtle when you use this, but it's a nice way to tickle the whole frequency spectrum and to create this kind of a ripple through it. I've used this with harsher sounds, and this is a really nice way to get a scooped separation between lows and highs if you're going for a neuro sound. And then we got an EQ. And that's how to make this sound right here. In addition to these two synthesizers, which are hocketing off of each other, there's just one more channel that I've actually thrown into my drum group up here. And this is basically all my lead lines sent through a Clouds granular synthesizer on my Eurorack. So these are just really cool sounds that I made by granulating the leads right here. And I normally do this just for this exact purpose, to put little fills in here. And I highly recommend your workflow this way. Make like two really good sounds, get them to vibe off each other, make the whole phrase, put it together, and then render all that as audio or send all of it into some kind of really crazy effect, something that really sounds unique, that stretches the sound apart. I really love Mutable Instruments Clouds, and so I just have this long session up here that I've cut up into a bunch of different pieces of these moments. These are kind of I think that is a really efficient way to make fills for yourself, to just start with the strong bits and then remix the strong bits and put them in between the phrases. Now let's check out the second drop. It's at about this point in the song that you get to hear my eternal fascination with rhythms turning into tones and tones turning into rhythms. And that's what you're hearing right here. That is a synthesizer that is pitched so far down that the tone becomes a rhythm, and then I'm using different methods for pitch bend to get that back up into a tone and kind of moving back and forth between tone and rhythm. This is a fascination I've had since college, actually. When I first got really heavily into sound design, it was through glitch music and IDM, and I was really into Venetian snares, Aphex Twin, and Square Pusher. A lot of these artists have beats that are so fast that they turn into these tones. I always thought that was so fascinating that if you speed up a beat fast enough, it becomes a tone, and if you slow down a tone, it turns into a rhythm. And exploring the relationship between rhythm and being a frequency and tones being a frequency that you can move between has been a cornerstone of my electronic music production and sound design exploration. So this is a example of that fascination, and it is all contained here. Let me unfreeze this track. All right, it sounds a little different because I haven't unfrozen this for a little while, but let's start with the sound source, which is Zeta 2. Now, I know I said that I would do all the sound design in Ableton, but this is another plugin that I highly encourage people to get. This is a plugin not a lot of people even know exists. This is called Zeta 2 by Cakewalk. Cakewalk went out of business, unfortunately, a little while ago, but I think that you can still buy Zeta 2. And if you go over to, if you click on their logo, you'll find my name up in the upper right-hand corner as a sound designer. I've been working on this for a really long time. I really like the tone of Zeta 2. I especially like the filters. I like the sound of the oscillators. And I actually also like the way that you patch with it. Now, this came out before the age of drag and drop patching that you see in like Serum and Massive and in Pigments. I love that style of patching. Here it's a little bit harder. You have source and destination are your main ways of hooking up envelopes to things. But you have a lot of different envelopes here. And one thing that I really like is that you can hook an envelope up to control the pitch of every oscillator at the same time. That's all osc pitch here. So all of my oscillators right now are tied to EG4, which is envelope 4 right here. And this is just a gated envelope, and you can see that my amount is turned all the way up. And what that means is that I am pitch shifting up by 4 octaves. 4 octaves on the top, 4 octaves on the bottom. So this is like a whole, keyboard worth of octaves right here. And by sweeping this, I can really quickly and efficiently get from a really high frequency to a rhythmic frequency. And this is how I do most of my mutations between higher frequencies and rhythm frequencies. Once it comes out as Zeta 2, whenever you lower the pitch of something so much, it actually loses a lot of its volume. It loses its harmonics because you've just, taken all those harmonics and put it down in a range that's barely audible. So my main sound design trick here is to make up for those lost harmonics that you get when you pitch it way far down by putting artificial harmonics on it using corpus and using distortion. So right here we have some more overdrive, just like in my other track. Here is auto filter with the drive turned all the way up, some dynamic tube. You've seen all these tricks before. And some trash 2 on the end. It is really the sound of distortion that you're hearing fill in the top end when this synthesizer dips all the way to a rhythm frequency. So without all of these effects, let me just group all of them and turn them off. There we go, and turn trash 2 off. Here's what Zeta 2 sounds like on its own. Listen to that. They're just little pops. Kind of like what you might use in psytrance, what you might call squelch. Those little pops have no flavor and shape and timbre and wideness. So all of that stuff is added artificially. This is what it sounds like with just the Ableton effects. Corpus is doing a lot of heavy lifting right here. Corpus is adding a 500 millisecond artificially acoustic decay to each little pop, and it's following the frequency of itself, MIDI from itself, and then all of that is getting its ounce in trash 2. Hey, quick story. One time I was hanging out with someone from Isotope, and I was hanging out with someone who worked for Cakewalk, and I put them in the same room together. I was like, you guys, Your products go together so well. And I just had to sit down and say, I do so much of my sound design with Zeta 2 going low level into Trash 2, and Trash 2 being the one that brings up the volume. Here we got the drive of slight twist all the way up, and then we got stage 2. Oh, tape saturation 4.5. That's why I'm almost always do. This one's got a limiter, and it's also got a lot of making up to do in the high end. The combination of these plugins, Zeta 2 and Trash 2, then with all this great Ableton stuff in between, makes up for the majority of the Z sounds that I'm asked about. So I highly recommend that you check it out and play with it. One artist that I got to give props to is Flintwick. If you check out the music of Flintwick, he messes with Zeta 2. He does a lot of the same filter and time stretchy, pitch bendy stuff that I do. And he takes it to another realm. He makes it funky and does things with it that I wouldn't have thought to do. So I'm always curious when people take these techniques to new levels. I highly encourage everyone to check out all of this stuff. I have no secrets. And now it's time for the main feature. I've been waiting to show this to you. This is the grand build-up section for this track. And as I play it, I'm going to let you watch this rendered MIDI go by so you can kind of get an idea for how this sound is made before I tell you. I had a lot of fun making this. I kind of knew what I wanted it to sound like before I started. I knew that I wanted it to be a grand wind-up of that phrase outside the box. And I actually tried a couple different ways to make this sound. I started with granular synthesis. I tried cutting it up by hand. That was no good right off the bat. And what I ended up landing on was using a sampler. So all of this is made with Ableton stock and MIDI. This is actually two samplers that combine to make this whole moment. The first one comes in, and then you see that this is an auto filter. It kind of filters out. And right at that crossover is right when the second sampler filters in. Where is that filter? Oh, I think right here. Oh, there we go. Filters in from the top. This is coming in with a high pass. And we'll start with this one. So the repetition is made with arpeggiator, and I could just send a note into it right now to show you. When you're on free mode, you can just grab rate and go all the way up to 10 milliseconds, which is an audible frequency. And then down there to 1 whole second. All I'm doing is I'm automating this to get faster and faster and faster and faster. Now, after that, we have to scan through the sample. And if you go over here to look at the sample, you can see if it stayed in the same place, it would be playing back from ah all the time. But instead, the playback position moves slightly to the right. We do that using velocity. Right here, I have velocity moving around, and in my MIDI section, we have velocity controlling sample offset. This is an awesome trick. I think that I got to give credit to Halfred, who showed me this trick, that if you can use velocity to move around the playback position of the sample, but you're only gonna hear that with each new note. So if you're repeating a note a lot and that note's changing velocity, you can move it around. Actually, you can do some really interesting sound design with this. Let's take it a different direction. I'm going to do velocity right here and turn up the random. So this is like a way to turn your sampler into kind of a granular synthesizer, since you are randomizing the playback position. And I bet you could probably make an instrument rack with a whole bunch of samplers that contain the same sound, and then pan them all around and make a for real granular synthesizer using these same two tools. The velocity trick comes in action the most, though, on the second one. Let's listen to this one fade in. We'll go over to the sample. So it starts with just the beginning. And then we scan through the sample from outside to box. And slowly that slows down. And when it stops, when it lands on its last sample, is when it just becomes such a tone. And I planned that tone in advance. All I did was I used my ear to find what this rate should end up landing at, and then I automated it to get there. And this is actually something I end up doing with a lot of parameters I automate. You find the spot first, and then you add the automation to get to that spot. So 17.3 was the note that I was trying to land on. And then we kind of automate to finally get to this tone. By the time I'm at that tone, that little amount of that portion of MIDI, when played, is played so fast that it just turns into a tone. And in order to understand that, I created this render right here. And all this is I recorded the output of this channel right here into an empty MIDI channel. So there's no instrument in here. But I wanted a way that you could see this MIDI, because it's really ridiculous. I mean, this is a lot of little MIDI notes going by so fast that you hear a tone. And the way it winds up, I think it's really visually pretty stunning. Once we get there to the top, we come back in with the beat, and I called this drop fake because it gets to the top and you're just, by here, I got this bass face on and it starts repeating, and then the beat kind of slowly comes back in. That little fill right there comes from clouds. Since it's the same sample, these sounds hawk it together really well. It's the same concept that I did from earlier on in the track with the bass sound, except now we're doing it with the vocal sound. Now let's check out the sound design in the second half of this track. I think that's a really gnarly drop, if I do say so myself. Here is the vocal sample that starts it off. And I think that I'm warping that sample just by playing with vocal synth and then resampling this, which is why it's called resample. And then we got an audio effect track here containing echo. And to get this tone here, we got to push echo all the way up to 125% feedback. Now, be careful doing this at home. Notice that my echo is in a channel that is turned off right now. I love playing with feedback, but whenever you put your feedback past 100%, there's the possibility of getting a real ear-piercing tone. So what I do to protect myself is, while I'm messing around with this stuff, I create another resample track. Notice that the input of that track is set to the one right above it. And what we're ultimately hearing in the track is just a recording of that feedback. And the only reason I do that is for me. So when I'm playing with this track, I don't need to worry about getting blasted by 125% feedback whenever I'm on bar 113. Let's go into the bass sounds that appear in this section that are a little bit different from the other ones. Here we have a hocket of 2 operator patches. And down here at the bottom, this has been going intermittently the whole track. I also have an operator running all of my kind of 808-esque low end. Let me just solo that for a sec. It's not much to that one, and that is going to be layered beneath this guy. So you can hear that they're playing the same note. They're kind of doing the same phrase, and this is carrying the very low bottom, and this guy right here is doing all the decoration in the mids and top range. And as you can see, again, this is just all Ableton stock sounds. So the highlight of this sound, I think, is the FM synthesis here. For this FM womp sound, it's kind of high pitched. It's a laser beam sound. And instead of doing your traditional unfixed coarse ratio here, I'm in fixed mode and I am tuning the frequency by ear. So when we get to a section like this, all of these were created probably with the pencil tool and finding a really neat spot and then automating around those spots right there. And that allows you to sometimes find things you couldn't find before. Like here we have a bend. Let's see how that sounds. Really cool little sound right there. A lot of time with FM synthesis, especially if you want to get really dirty and nasty, you know, try to break outside the harmonic box there and try to get these weird tones in between the notes. You know, I don't know what note this is, but it sounds really good with the fundamental down there. So that sound is hocketing. By the way, it gets a lot of its tone the exact same way that the other sounds in this track get their tone. You see a lot of the same characters here, corpus with string and overdrive and OTT. All of these are recurring characters there. And then we have this other patch right here, which is doing the real womps. I love it when it comes back in over here. Yeah, I remember making this, and my girlfriend at the time was sitting on the couch, and I turned around, and she had bass face. She was like, "Oh, you gotta keep that part." So, because that really, I think, you know, really hits a note with the dubstep community. So this is a classic dubsteppy kind of sound, and of course, it's made with operator, with all the other tricks I'm using. Let's pick this one apart a little bit because this one is using partials here that are harmonics of the fundamental, whereas the other one is in fixed mode. This is in coarse. And I discovered something while making this track. If you actually automate in coarse mode, you end up getting a smooth bend between the different harmonics that you're going to. So watch this moment. It goes, what? And then it's going up and down. That kind of bend I didn't expect to get because these are all integers. These are quantized numbers right here. So when I started playing with that, I really had fun. I think I discovered it probably in the second half right here, and I went crazy. That's the same sound right there. All bending the coarse knob right here and finding neat harmonics to play as the carrier into oscillator A. Here we have just a normal envelope right here. Notice it's actually quite long, and then that is compensated with time over here. You could take a patch that sounds really long, really wompy, and then bring the time down. It just turns into such a nice little chirp. I'm constantly experimenting with time because time is a macro. It is tied to every single envelope inside of operator. So time is something that you might not experiment until after you've made the patch, or it might be you open up a patch that you've already made that worked for one style and you want to get it to try to work with your current style. Check out time. It is one of the most powerful macros. Down here is just a little augmentation. This is just another little gnarly womp that I threw in there to be a sub-hocket, I guess. So here are your two main hocket synthesizer sounds. And then this guy is for mainly syncopation. I wanted it to sound like this is a cohesive sound that kind of just mutates for a second into kind of this lower gnarly timbre. And honestly, I recommend that for your workflow. Start out with 2 synthesizers maybe that you're hocketing together. And then the third one, instead of being just another sound that stands out just as much as those first 2, the third one should complement one of them for less amount of time, just as like this momentary syncopated flavor that you add to one of the sounds. Now let's check out how we do the mix and the drums in this track. As you can see, the mixing hierarchy is incredibly simplified. We have 2 groups. One's called drum, the other called gatekeeper. And our gatekeeper group is anything that I want to be sidechain compressed. And normally I use Ableton sidechain compression, but this track is, I think this track called for some really extreme sidechain compression. So I'm using Gatekeeper, which is a cheap plugin by Infected Mushroom that works just like Ableton sidechain compressor, except it really 100% gets rid of the sound, and then you can come back into a rhythmic subdivision, which I find incredibly useful. Up here in my drum channel, let's just solo it for a second and play back the second drop. So as you can hear, there's not entirely drums in this channel. It is drums, and we have a group dedicated to all of the granular splurts that came out of my Clouds Eurorack module. Those are great sounds, and I got to give a shout out to Mutable Instruments Clouds, because I made these sounds just by running aspects of this track into this granulator and recording jams, recording the outputs, and that gives me a sufficient amount of fills and interesting sound design to put into the track and make things sound really, really thorough and wide and crazy. So I'm gonna mute that for a second. Going up here, I have a very typical mixing hierarchy. I think these are only on the top because I dragged them in there like last minute, so just ignore these guys. Because normally my drum rack that contains my kick and the snare is normally my very first track. It's on the very top. And here I have my main kick snare. To make this sound, let's see. We've got an instrument racks, and I'm just using a kick drum that I got out of a Cymatics sample pack. Sometimes I make my own kicks. This one I definitely went the lazy route. I put a little resonance right around the sub frequency, which in this case is okay because I'm using the amplitude envelope to get the sound out of the way in time for the bass to come in. So it's actually, this kick drum is working together with the sub at the very bottom right here to create the illusion of one unified kind of an 808 kick drum sound. And I call this composite synthesis. It's a way of thinking about it. Think about the kick and the bass need to merge into the same sound. And to do that, most of the time people use a filter, a high pass filter, and they'll just get all the low end out of their kick drum. But I find a lot of the time you can keep the low end as long as you use the amplitude envelope to fade out the sample fast enough. So hopefully it's kind of achieved right here. There's still some ounce in there. Then we have a little snare right here. The snare is made with operator, which I'm really proud of. Here we have a triangle wave. We have some noise and then some more noise. There's 2 kinds of noise, looped and white. I'm using both of them. I'm putting a little transient on it using the pitch envelope. And I also have a lot of filter drive and a high pass filter with a lot of resonance. And that's coming out and passing through echo with a little bit of reverb and some overdrive and a lot of compression with soft clip on to get that snare sound out of operator. And I don't think it's just operator. I think we also got a clap sound. With this clap sound, notice I'm fading in right here. And this is something I often do when it comes to high timbre sort of clap sounds, especially when I don't want the transient of the clap sound to interfere with the transient I've already spent time making in my snare. And I think that this is one of the best ways to layer claps and snares is choose which one you want to really punch through the mix. I mean, which is the instrument that is carrying that first 100 milliseconds. And then the other one is kind of the tail. It's kind of the timbre that comes afterwards. It's the decoration in the top end. So this guy can fade in because that's not where my punch is. And my fade in right here is 76 milliseconds. So it's significant. You're just hearing the splash. These are my most important sounds. And then if I take it away, we have all this secondary percussion. And this is where I put a little more coloration on the snare. I got that great sound right there, heavily filtered. And then some drum and bass sounds I've collected. Those are all my syncopated beats. I think it's important to put these into different channels because you normally want to mix these a little bit lower. You normally want to filter them in certain ways. When you add percussion and snare fills that aren't directly going to affect some kind of sidechain compressor, these are all just considered different kinds of instruments apart from the grand kick and snare, which is running your whole tune. All of these little percussive bits should probably live in other channels. We got a noise drop. We got 707 sounds in here. And all of them come together to make the beat of this track. To top everything off here, in case I skipped a sound that you were hoping to hear about, I'm going to just show you some of the sounds in here that were created not using Ableton stock. And one of them is this breakdown right here in this group just called Cinematic. All of those sounds are literally from the plugin Hexaract, as you can see right here. I got this plugin on an impulse buy, and it's just really good for moody cinematic stuff. And I just decided to go all out exploring the presets in this breakdown. So you can find all those in the Hexaract presets. And then in the beginning right here and throughout the track, I also want to show you one core of a lot of Z music that appears on this EP is my use of bell sounds. My tracks Transcend and End Trance all feature the bell sounds, and for the most part I'm getting those out of Chromophone. I have already showed you Corpus. Corpus is created by AAS in collaboration with Ableton, and their product Chromophone is one of my favorite plugins. I use Chromophone in most of my music these days just because I love bell sounds. And with this sound, we are spatializing a bit with echo. You also hear it kind of sounds cruddy, and that's from the Redux. I do a bit reduction. And we have Corpus right here, which is sidechained to itself. So this is just another stage of physical modeling. One thing I really like about Chromophone is that it does not use samples. This is not a sample that you're hearing. This is instead created the exact same way that Corpus creates tones. This is created by physical modeling. So we have resonator A right here, and resonator B is off. This is a marimba model, and you can send bursts of noise and mallet strikes into it to create the tone. So I highly recommend if you're into these kinds of bell sounds to go get Chromophone and start experimenting with it. I normally start with a preset, and then I kind of change it and move it to fit with my track. I'm going to send you out with a very brief explanation of how I mastered this track. First of all, observe how I set up my mastering group right here. I never put my mastering plugins onto a track. I put it in a group. And the reason is quite simple. Because I master my own tracks, I'll often put a track in and realize there are problems in the mix and then go back and fix it and then put a new version in. So here you see outside the box version 12, version 12C, and then version 13. That's me going back and forth between this session and the session that you just saw to dial in the perfect mix. The other reason that I put my tracks inside of a group before it hits the mastering plugin is so I can do volume automation. As you can see, during the intro, we're 3 decibels below the drop. And when you automate the volume before it hits the mastering plugin, it's the same thing as changing the limiter, maximizer, threshold. You are giving it more dynamics. You're not making it necessarily quieter depending on your settings. You're just giving it more dynamics. So that intro and outro I felt needed to breathe a bit more dynamically. In my group, really the only thing that I'm using for mastering is Ozone 8. And the rest of this is to just look at the spectrum, to be my eyes and ears here. I do a lot of mastering visually, so I have insight and tonal balance right here. In tonal balance, I have presets. Here's my End Trance EP preset, which gives me the curve of all of the other mastered tracks on that EP. And then I've got equalizer, which I'll show you about in just a second. But let's take a look at my Ozone patch. As you can see, I really utilize all the different modules in Ozone. We start with a little bit of EQ and then vintage EQ, which I think sounds great. I mean, I will use this on something even if I don't really need it because I think it sounds really good. And then we got a little dynamics. Notice that all these frequency bands all have parallel compression. So I got the dry wet turned down just a little bit on these to let the natural dynamics through. That goes into a vintage tape machine, which I think sounds great. And then a little dynamic EQ. And I created this preset by using Ozone's artificial intelligence. You see I have another Ozone 8 right here. What I do is I use Master Assistant and I allow Ozone's AI to build a mastering preset for me. And in this case, I just saved the dynamic EQ preset and then I opened it in this other Ozone right here. So this is a nice way to have the AI control an aspect of your master, but not necessarily the whole thing. And then we end with the maximizer, where we're using some good maximizer preferences right here, which is true peak and a little bit of ceiling. And I don't normally use transient emphasis, but sounded pretty good in this one. And IRC4 modern, which I use for most things. And then we have dithering right here, which is why you see a little noise at the end here is from the dithering. Let me show you one more really cool trick I have for when I master, and that is how I misuse Ozone 8 equalizer right here. So what I normally do is I find a track that I want my track to sound like, and I load it on up into the reference plane over here. And it looks like it's loading one of my tracks, but I don't know. Let's choose one of these. Cursa, Seppa. These are really loud, amazing tracks. So let me open up this one. And all I'm going to do is play it for a little while into this equalizer. And I'm going to use the matching EQ to create a curve. Yeah, so check this out. Let's play this portion. Whoa, that's loud. But anyway, as you play that, it creates a frequency curve. And then you can play your track into... Oh, now I got to play a banging section. And this is a good way to get a direct comparison for what your frequency spectrum footprint looks like compared to some other track. Now, the purpose of this, I think, is so you can use this soul smoothing and amount matching thing. All I use this for is to have a visual. This is one of my favorite visual accompaniments. And the main thing I'm looking at is the loudness of the low end and where we cross this middle line visually. Notice that with the Cursa Seppa track, we have a crossover from the top of this EQ line to the bottom, right around between 1K and 2K. Notice that mine also crosses over around then. So the balance of low to high is about the same, though their highs are definitely a bit more crispier than mine in their master. I use visual programs because I think that unless you're in a really amazing studio with a great pair of barefoot monitors, you will always have a bias, whether you're in headphones or in front of any other kind of speakers, or if your room has an echo, there will always be some kind of bias. So I've learned to trust my eyes over time just as much as I trust my ears in the mastering phase, and using these in conjunction with one another has been so useful in getting the tone right. Thank you for watching my outside the box tutorial all the way to the end. I've really enjoyed picking this track apart for you, and hopefully you got something good out of it. If you end up using any of these cool techniques, please drop a link down in the comments. I'd love to check it out. And please follow my Zebbler Encanti experience pages. Stay in touch. Hopefully I'll be doing more of these in the near future. Have a good day.